No son zesfenu meden olo sulupu prosoli honestitosen totelos ochronos.
Myth feels to me like one of the biggest topics we could try to cover in this course. A myth is, in a way, a story, the story we try to tell about ourselves and our world to make sense of it. So in this conversation, we're going to try to understand where the word comes from, what it means, and especially what it has to do with our sense of meaning, of sense-making and identity. We'll also look at some definitions of myth, and we'll explore some theories of myth, both ancient Greek and modern, and then we'll try to apply them to a particular story. This is the story of the Theogony, that is, the birth of the gods, or the origin of the cosmos as we know it, that was written by Hesiod, a Greek epic poet, sometime maybe if he wrote or sang orally and improvised it in the 8th or 7th century BC. So let's start with this word, mythos. It comes from the Greek muthos, and a mythos is basically a speech or a story. So if you get up and call a friend and you say, you'll never believe what happened to me yesterday, that's a mythos. It can also be something quite serious, like a story about why the stars don't fall. Could be a scientific story. It could be an oral tradition. It could be an anecdote. Later on, this word myth is paired with logos. Logos is a really famous Greek word as well, in the sense that a lot of English words and other words in modern languages that are familiar to us involve it somehow. Any word that ends in ology, like biology, the study of life, psychology, the study of the psyche, geology, the study of the earth, that logy at the end comes from logos. And in that sense, it can mean, again, a way of making sense of something, a way of understanding it. It's also the log root in our word logic. And for that reason, you can kind of easily see why it's often associated with reason, with rationality. But it means a lot more than that. More subtly, what logos really means, I think, is meaning. If in ancient Greek you wanted to say, uden leges, you're not logosing anything. You're not trying to say exactly that you're not being rational, and you're also not saying you're not making any sounds. What you're saying is, I don't really understand. You're not making sense. And in a way, if you look at all the different ways that our dictionaries try to understand that ancient Greek word in Greek literature more subtly, I think meaning or sense is a way of getting at it. So if you try to put these two together, mythos and logos, of course you get our word in English, mythology, and you can also sort of see why it's important or what the meaning of it might be. It's to look for the meaning or the logos in the mythos, the sense in the story. From that perspective, we can also spend some time thinking about how human identity is shaped around our stories. And according to a theory called narrative identity, which comes out of an interdisciplinary framework, including psychology and anthropology and other disciplines, human beings are always trying to integrate our experiences, our impressions, our sensations to find coherent patterns of meaning in our day-to-day life, as if we were in a novel or in a story or in a myth. Through this, we're searching for a sense of sense, for purpose, but also in a way we're cultivating our own intrinsic motivation, our reason to do things because of who we are. In some ways that can help us sometimes do what's difficult rather than what's comfortable, to not necessarily just seek out what's pleasant and avoid what's painful. It can also help us to find meaning in our lives, or at least that's the hope. And this is also part of a theory that had a significant vogue in the later 20th century, that human beings are intrinsically storytelling beings to ourselves and others, sometimes called the homo narrans theory, the storytelling human. So we'll be exploring applications of these ideas in how curiosity developed in prototypical philosophy and science in ancient Greece, how this search for understanding, this curiosity for meaning, helped to shape us. And one way you can sort of play with this idea maybe of narrative identity and also mythos and logos is to ask when you're starting the day, in a way, what kind of story am I living in right now? Does this feel like a tragedy, a comedy, an epic? Is it absurd? Is it profound? There may not really be answers to these questions, at least not a right answer that is like one size fits all. But it's a way of seeing, in a way, what, according to that theory, might be going on unconsciously, what we're always trying to do in making sense of experience. I should stress this is only one particular fragment or one particular angle on these huge questions. So I don't want to make the claim that this is the right way to look either at myth or, to say the least, at the meaning of life. But I'm hoping it's a way to connect them, as we'll see, that we're always trying to find a way to string our experiences together coherently as a story. And I'll sometimes bring up this idea that we're looking for the logos in the mythos, the sense in the story as we go. Again, whether it's abstract philosophy and science or it's a legend. One way to sort of add some context or flavor to that way of understanding meaning making is to see that it even has some traction in contemporary neuroscience. That's not necessarily very ancient Greek, but it does resonate with some ways that the Greeks thought about this, that we can recognize how our minds are always trying in their effort to engage the world to find meaning in our experiences, and that we can detect this as a kind of constant for human beings everywhere. I'd like to invite us to think about one story in particular. So again, this is a really fundamental one for the Greeks. It's the Theogony story, the origin of the Olympian world order that we live in, according to the Greeks who lived in Hesiod's time, around the 8th century and later. And it begins like this. Once upon a time, there was the Titan god Kronos. Now, Kronos was bent on devouring his children. Why, you might ask? Well, he wanted to retain the power that he had seized from his father, Uranos the sky. And he had heard that one of his children would overthrow him as he overthrew his father before him. Now, the Titan Rhea, whose name means flow, was the mother of Kronos' children. She outwitted him in the last case with his youngest child, by feeding him, instead of the child, the omphalos stone. This word omphalos literally means navel. It later emerged in ancient Delphi, perceived to be the center of the Mediterranean world. And when Kronos ate the omphalos stone instead, Rhea hid the real child in a cave on the island of Crete. This child, of course, was Zeus. Beings called the Kurites made all kinds of noise around Zeus, dancing around him in the cave, being as loud as they could to drown out his cries, so Kronos wouldn't hear him and realize he'd been deceived. Now, of course, Zeus eventually grew up and took counsel with his mother Rhea about how to free his sisters and brothers who were in his father's tummy. These would later become the Olympians, but at this point they were imprisoned. They asked for the advice of Rhea's mother, Zeus's granny, the Earth, Gaia. And Gaia's advice was that they should try to liberate these monsters that had been imprisoned by Kronos ages ago at the primordial beginning of the universe in the deep, dark depth of the Earth, in Tartarus. These monsters were prototypes of the Cyclopses, among other kinds of very ancient primordial beings of enormous power, and among them they had the power of the lightning bolt. Now, with the aid of their energy brought up from the deep and this thunderbolt, Zeus was able to overthrow the rule of Kronos and the Titans together with his brothers and sisters. He then swallowed the Titan Mythos, whose name means wisdom, so in a way he internalized wisdom, according to the myth, and then he established the cosmos as we know it, where the Olympians each represent a province of expertise or power in a way. Aphrodite, love; Athena, wisdom; Ares, war; Apollo, music, and so on. And that order continued to govern with wisdom and justice, again, as the story goes. So let's try to hold this story in mind, and we'll talk a little bit about myth in general and think about how some different theories could be applied to it. First, just to help give us a bit of geography briefly. Myth is really hard to talk about because in a broad way it can just mean any story. So here's one way scholars sometimes try to pin it down, that a myth is a story supported by cultural tradition. It's not just my story of how long I had to, wait for the bus yesterday. It's a story that has some resonance with a group. It has collective meaning. Also, it's usually a story that's not literally true, so it's not just straight history. There's something that in a literal level is false, even if there's a deeper meaning that you can detect if you go below the surface. Now, if you looked at myth in this kind of broad way, there's a number of ways of subdividing stories in that wide sense. So you can talk about stories that have historical roots. Sometimes they're called sagas. Stories with historical roots that also have a kind of moral to tell, sometimes called legend. If you're fond of them, you can think of the Arthurian legends, Arthur and Merlin and Excalibur and that great story. There's also folk tales, stories with fantastic elements, fairies and magicians, also sometimes with a moral, sometimes featuring a kind of every person. And if you divide things up like that, you can think about myth especially as, properly speaking, a story that somehow involves the gods. But then these categories can still sometimes be too sharp, too restrictive. So we don't necessarily want to be too doctrinaire about them. Still, they can be a helpful way to start dividing things up if we need to. Let's think about some ancient Greek theories of myth. So here's one of the best known, sometimes called historicism. It's associated with the name of Euhemerus of Messina all the way back to the 4th century BC. It's kind of intuitive. Where do these stories come from about gods like Kronos and Rhea and Zeus? Well, on this view, there actually was probably in the distant past a king called Kronos who had a son named Zeus who was saved by his mother Rhea and later overthrew his father and took over the kingship. And of course, over time, the story was expanded and enhanced and transformed in different ways and became the myth. But originally it was history. So in this view, myths retell and transform historical facts, and that's how we get them. A whole other class of views, particularly favored by Greek philosophers like Plato and the Stoics, interprets myth as allegories from the Greek allegoria, kind of leading to something different. So on this view, the surface level leads somewhere else. According to natural allegory, myths symbolize natural processes. So Zeus, who wields the lightning, might represent fire. Hera, his wife, might represent the air, and stories about Zeus and Hera's relationship might reflect stories about the relating of earth and fire, fire and air, two of the basic elements. According to philosophical allegory, myths rather symbolize deeper realities of nature. This can include psychology, so stories about Aphrodite, the goddess of love, can represent our basic impulse to love and fondness and care. Stories about Ares can represent our feature, our quality of anger, of repulsion. And that's also quite deep. Metaphysical allegory can also be important, so stories about let's say, Aphrodite again, and attraction can be deep stories about any kind of attraction in the natural world, between people and animals, and in general, the force that binds the world together, that keeps things from falling apart. So in that view, the story on the surface level can mean something quite deep allegorically. Coming next to some more modern theories of the 20th century, right on the cusp of the 20th century, one of the most significant developments in theories of myth was the myth-ritual school of interpretation associated with the Cambridge ritualists. On this view, myths accompany and interpret ritual actions. So for example, think of that story of the Curetes making a lot of noise in the cave, dancing around Zeus to drown out his cries. Now, there actually were ritual performances and practices of dancing loudly in caves, making as much noise as you could, associated with sometimes people who took on the role of Curetes. On this view, that ritual, that performance needs some explanation. Why are we doing this? And the myth gives an answer, an explanation. So in that sense, the myth accompanies the ritual. Very famously, another set of 20th century theories involves Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, his student who took a rather different view. On Freud's position, myths generally involve our waking effort to systematize visions and impulses from our dreams. And our dreams are actually our wishes fulfilled in symbolic disguise. So we have a wish that we can't think about consciously. It's too surprising to us. So we experience it in a dream, in a symbolic form, and then we try to make sense of the dream in waking life, and we get a myth. Jung was not entirely unsympathetic to that kind of interpretation, but he thought that we needed to be broader. Not all myths come out of disguised wish fulfillment. On his view, there's a sort of underlying fund of archetypal patterns of movement, instinct, desire, and meaning in the collective unconscious of all human beings that we all share. And myths give manifestation, give a voice, give a face to these basic human experiences. This kind of theory comes out in the work of Joseph Campbell, the monomyth or hero's journey, that we see, for example, in the Star Wars films that George Lucas originally, to some degree, modeled on the work of Campbell with this Jungian atmosphere. The Canadian literary critic Northrop Frye practiced a different kind of archetypal literary criticism, but this sort of idea that there's something kind of fundamental in the motifs of myth that repeat themselves. That's also a position we can see in some more recent developments. So developments over the last half century or so, one of the most prominent of which is the advent of structuralist analysis of myths. According to this view, myths do display recurrent structural motifs, but these are particularly intended to raise and sometimes resolve cultural and social tensions. So let's compare a structuralist, Jungian, and Freudian approach to the story we just told. On the Freudian view, it's not too hard to see what's going on here. Children want to overthrow their parents, and that creates a certain anxiety and a wish fulfillment that can sometimes occur in a disguised form in dreams and be interpreted as a myth. Zeus wanting to overthrow his father in the myth, the anxiety that Kronos feels about this happening to him as he overthrew his father, well, it's simple. The myth expresses those disguised wishes. On the Jungian view, and in fact, Jungian critics were interested in myths like this one, there is something deeper going on. In fact, the realm of the Titans of Kronos represents a kind of unconscious level of human experience. These kind of primal forces, where the Olympian order of Zeus and his siblings represent something more conscious, something more familiar. And the myth explains or illustrates or symbolizes how we get our kind of conscious experience out of the deep fund of our primal unconscious experience. For the structuralist, taking us back to the Freudian sort of picture, there's an anxiety here that the myth expresses, but it's much broader. It represents social anxiety. And if we think of the social context in which this myth developed, we're back in the Iron Age, leading into the Archaic period in Greece. A lot of societies are still basically kind of mini monarchies, where a king governs and passes power by bloodline to usually a son. And there's a great deal of collective anxiety about how this transition will take place. Will it be peaceful? Will it be smooth? And that tension is expressed and in some ways resolved by this myth. Because one feature of the myth is that once the transition has taken place and the violence ends, there's a stability to the Olympian order. And so perhaps there will be in one of these societies as well. A lot of these descriptions leave out some very important elements in the assumed power structures and identities and orientation of the myths. And we can see this in some of the later developments of the 20th century and the early 21st century as well. One is to recognize that most of these myths center characters that identify as men, whether they're gods or humans. They center patriarchal assumptions of power, Usually, for example, it is kings passing power to princes rather than queens to daughters. And we can also see that there's all kinds of inequities that are encoded and reinscribed through these stories, assumptions about gender roles that disempower women and empower men in particular. And this recognition has led to lots of fruitful new developments, both in the study and criticism of myths and in the recreation of myths, told from a new perspective, which we'll come to in a minute. A lot of other approaches also take account of how power structures are encoded in myth and how identity and status is constructed in myths through these recurrent structural motifs. So I think we're much more sensitive now, perhaps, than several generations ago to the role that myths can play in reinforcing social structures of oppression and power. Consider the story again we told with the structuralists, where we're in a kind of Iron Age or heading into the Archaic period in Greece. This is 8th, 7th, 6th centuries BC, where there are still societies that are governed in this way by kings and their bloodline. Telling a story like this can help to reinforce that tale and reinforce that power structure, to legitimate it, to validate it. Challenging the myth at that level can also be a way of finding, hopefully, some freedom from that power structure. One way to enact that kind of challenge is, in particular, to center some of the voices that are marginalized in the myth. We never really hear from Rhea, for example, in the story that is told in Hesiod, as much as we do from Kronos or from Zeus. Why is that? What's Rhea's perspective in this story? What about Hestia, who we'll talk about a bit later, who was in fact the eldest of the children of Kronos? So one of the ways that's developed, as I mentioned before, is new tellings of myths with new centers and new peripheries. Margaret Atwood's telling of the Odyssey story, that's the return of the hero Odysseus from Troy, but from the perspective of Penelope, represented as Odysseus's wife in the story. Some of Madeline Miller's work centering the character of Circe, the witch, the magician, the semi-immortal woman who Odysseus encounters on his travels, telling the story through her eyes, and in a way a whole other story from her perspective. In the visual arts as well, for example, reimagining works of classical Greek myth with Black women at the center, in recent work in Los Angeles with the artist Harmonia Rosales, or the first translation ever of Homer's Odyssey, again the tale of Odysseus, by a woman. It took until just a few years ago with Emily Wilson's excellent translation in English. So those are just some examples of how, through the criticism of myths, new tellings and new developments have also flowered from that soil. If we think of all the different myths, all the different theories of myth that we've been exploring, there's almost a dizzying array. We have, again, the reading of the myth as a kind of retelling of history, the reading of myth as an allegory of natural processes, of rituals, the Freudian and Jungian psychological perspectives, structural patterns, the recognition of patriarchal and other power structures in the myth and the centering of women's voices, the recognition too, as significant as this is, of the dynamics of power that are inscribed and validated in the myth. So all of those can be seen as really significant ways of finding, if you like, the logos in the mythos, the sense in the myth. And you can see that they also kind of open a road to creativity, new ways of understanding the myths, of applying them to our own experiences of justice and injustice in the world, of meaning in our own lives, and potentially new ways of retelling the stories or telling them afresh. And it's also in that spirit that we'll encounter some of the ancient philosophical allegories, some of these deep allegories. I'll give you one more example of this as well. On one view, for example, we hear from the Middle Platonist philosopher Plutarch, Kronos, whose name sounds very much like the Greek word for time, Kronos, actually is time. Father Time, that name comes from this story. Whereas Zeus, well, his name sounds very much like the Greek word for life, zoein. You still find that in words today like zoology, just like you find Kronos' name in words like chronology for time. This myth, on this view, is a story about how life somehow thrives in spite of entropy, in spite of time. Zeus, symbolizing the flowering of life, represents, in a way, life's amazing resilience, the ability of these meaningful patterns of energy to endure and thrive, even in the face of time and entropy. They were using some modern language and understanding it, but that's sort of part of the spirit of a philosophical interpretation of this story, why we are in the age of life. And that's also a way of looking at the origin of the Olympian order that we'll be talking about next, where this sort of network, this interpenetrating manifold of divine spheres of influence helps to explain and find meaning in the world we're in today, psychologically, naturally, and even metaphysically. So in review, we've talked a bit about the word mythos and what it means, how it's significant to our approaches to finding meaning and identity in life, some definitions of myth, and a range of theories of myth, ancient and modern. And we've also looked a little bit at Hesiod's Theogony narrative in particular.
Nos sons